A ruthless developer sent his men to terrorize an elderly couple so he could steal their land and the hidden cove beyond it. They cornered Walter and Helen on their own porch. They thought they were alone. They thought they were helpless. And when they shoved Walter into the mud, they believed they had already won. But they made fatal mistakes. They didn't know the quiet man in the next cabin was Ethan Brooks, a former Navy SEAL who still moved like the storm. And GermanShepherd K9 Ranger was the bridge between a soldier and two frightened seniors just waiting for the one-word command to attack. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Rain combed the Oregon coast into silver threads, and cedar trees held the wind like a secret. In Cedar Hollow, the ocean sounded like an old god breathing, slow and unimpressed. Ethan Brooks had come here to disappear without dying. At 38, he looked like a man carved from hard work and harder silence. Broad-shouldered, square-jawed, sun-browned skin weathered by salt and heat, with close-cropped dark hair and eyes that didn't wander unless they had to. People called him calm. The truth was simpler. Calm was the only way he knew to keep the past from making noise. He rented a small cabin at the edge of the forest, where moss clung to the steps and the air smelled of wet bark and wood smoke. He told himself it was a vacation, but his hands still checked corners, his mind still counted exits, and his chest still tightened whenever the world went too quiet, as if quiet was only the pause before impact. Ranger made the cabin feel less like a hiding place. The German Shepherd was massive, around 90 pounds, with a black saddle of fur and tan cream legs like worn leather gloves. His muzzle was darker, his ears always pricked as if listening to a radio station no one else could hear. Ranger was not a pet in the cute, clumsy way of suburban dogs. He moved with discipline and patience, a creature shaped by training and loyalty, the kind of companion who could turn fear into order just by sitting down. And yet, when Ethan's breathing turned shallow at night, Ranger would press his warm body against Ethan's shin, steady as a lighthouse, reminding him that the present was still real. In the late afternoon, as the rain softened into mist, Ethan noticed movement beyond the tree line. An old man at a fence, struggling with a latch that refused to cooperate. Walter Price was in his early 70s, thin as a weathered post, his shoulders sloped from years of labor and loss. A gray beard framed a face lined with the stubborn geography of decades. He leaned on a wooden cane that looked older than some marriages, and he worked the fence with the patience of someone who'd learned that anger wastes oxygen. Beside the porch of a nearby house, an elderly woman gathered damp firewood into a basket. Helen Price moved carefully, as if her bones negotiated every step. She was 70, short and soft around the middle, with pale skin and silver hair pinned back in a practical twist. Her eyes, though, were sharp and watchful, the kind of eyes that had learned to read a room before entering it. She glanced at Ethan's cabin, then away, as if respecting the boundary of a stranger's solitude. Ethan almost turned back inside. Almost. He told himself it wasn't his business, that he came here to stop being pulled into other people's storms. But Ranger's body shifted, alert without alarm, and Ethan felt the old instinct rise. Observe, assess, prevent. He walked down the muddy path, boots silent in the wet earth. "Need a hand?" he called, keeping his voice steady, non-threatening. Walter looked up, measuring Ethan with a cautious squint. Not fear exactly, more like a man who had been disappointed by too many smiles. "Fence has its own opinion," Walter said, a dry humor that sounded like it had survived hard winters. Ethan nodded once. "They usually do." He crouched, fingers quick and precise, and freed the latch with a twist and a press. Walter exhaled, half relief and half annoyance at needing help at all. "Appreciate it," he muttered, pride forced to share space with reality. Helen approached with the basket, pausing when she saw Ranger. Her body went stiff, breath caught at the top of her chest. "He won't," Ethan said softly, reading her fear before she spoke it. "Only moves if I tell him." That was true, but also incomplete. Ranger didn't only follow commands, he followed hearts. The dog stepped forward anyway, slow and respectful, then sat a few feet from Helen, posture perfect, head slightly lowered, as if offering a bow instead of a challenge. His eyes held hers with a strange gentleness, like a sentry recognizing a weary traveler. Helen's hands trembled. For a moment, she looked like she might scold herself for being afraid of a dog when life had already taught her worse. Then she let out a small laugh, surprised by it, like finding a forgotten coin in a coat pocket. "Well," she whispered, "aren't you a polite giant?" Ranger's tail thumped once, controlled but unmistakably pleased. The sound did something to Ethan's ribs, easing a knot he didn't realize he'd been carrying. Walter watched the exchange and cleared his throat, pretending not to be moved by it. "We're the Prices," he said, nodding toward the old house perched near the bluff. The home was simple and stubborn, cedar siding darkened by rain, windows framed with chipped white paint. It looked like it had endured more than weather. "Been here a long time," Helen added, her voice gentle but guarded. "Long enough to see folks come and go, and long enough to know when someone wants you gone." Ethan didn't ask who. He didn't need to. There were signs everywhere. Fresh survey stakes near the road, glossy flyers pinned at the general store, promises of development and opportunity dressed up like gifts. A name floated through town the way fog did, unavoidable and everywhere. Grant Halloway, a businessman with clean hands and dirty methods, buying land like collecting trophies. Walter's eyes turned toward the distant road, and the humor drained out of his face. "They keep offering," he said. "We keep saying no." Helen hugged the basket to her chest, as if holding it could anchor her to the porch. "It's not just land," she murmured, and her gaze flicked to the living room window, where a single framed photo sat facing outward, as if someone inside still wanted to see the sea Ethan understood without being told. The house was a memory made of wood. It was the last place that still spoke a dead name out loud. As evening fell, Ethan returned to his cabin, Ranger pacing once around the room before settling by the hearth. Ethan tried to clean gear he didn't need to clean, a ritual of control, but his mind kept replaying Helen's laugh and Walter's tired pride. Somewhere between the crackle of the fire and the steady rain, he almost believed he could stay uninvolved. Then, well after dark, an engine growled up the Price driveway. Headlights cut through the trees like knives. A pickup stopped hard, too loud for a friendly visit. Doors opened. Men stepped out, silhouettes in wet flannel and heavy boots, walking with the confidence of people who believed law was something you wore, not something you obeyed. Ethan's stomach tightened. Ranger rose without a sound, ears forward, body turning into a question. Ethan moved to the window and saw it. In the truck bed, half covered by a tarp, sat a red plastic gas can glistening with rain. If they came only to talk, why bring something that could turn an old house into smoke? Morning came pale and damp, as if the sun had overslept behind the clouds and refused to apologize. Cedar Hollow woke to the smell of wet cedar and ocean brine, and Ethan Brooks woke the way he always did, instantly, silently, as though sleep were a door that might be kicked in. Ranger lay near the hearth, but the dog's eyes opened before Ethan moved, amber-brown focus snapping into place. Ethan hated that he still lived like this, hated that peace felt like an ambush. Yet he trusted the pattern because it kept people alive. He took his coffee, black and bitter, then stood at the cabin window and watched the world breathe. Across the trees, the Price house sat stubborn against the wind, and the sight of it tightened something in him. Not duty, something closer to ache. He walked over after breakfast under a thin drizzle, Ranger at his heel, paws silent on moss. Walter Price was outside already, cane planted like a flag in the mud, his wiry frame wrapped in an old rain jacket that had lost its color years ago. He had the look of a man who measured pain and decided it didn't get a vote. Helen Price hovered near the porch steps, smaller than yesterday, shoulders curled inward as if she could shrink away from whatever was coming. Her silver hair was tucked under a knit cap, and her hands kept rubbing each other for warmth or for courage. When she saw Ranger, her face softened in spite of herself. The dog sat, calm as a priest, and Helen exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since last night. "I made tea," she said, voice polite, but her eyes asked a different question. "Are we alone?" Before Ethan could answer, the growl of an engine rolled up the driveway like thunder that had learned to drive. A pickup truck, the same one from the night before, lurched to a stop. 3 men climbed out as if the ground owed them space. The one in front was Derek, mid-30s, thick-necked, with a shaved head that made his face look harsher, more angular. A scar cut through one eyebrow like a careless signature. He wore a heavy jacket and work boots, but his posture wasn't worker. It was predator. His confidence had the smell of borrowed power, the kind that comes from serving someone richer and crueler. Behind him were 2 younger men, both broad-shouldered, both pretending they weren't nervous. One had a patchy beard and restless eyes that flicked toward Ranger too often. The other chewed something, jaw grinding like he could bite through consequences. Derek held a folder in one hand and smiled with his mouth only, as if he'd practiced it in a mirror. "Walter Price," he called, voice loud and casual, the way bullies announce themselves, so fear has time to arrive first. "Good news. We've got updated paperwork. Better offer. Last chance before things get complicated." Walter didn't step back. He didn't step forward either. He simply planted the cane and lifted his chin. "My answer didn't change overnight," he said. His voice was thin, but it carried. "Take your paper and go." Derek's smile tightened. He walked closer, boots sinking into the muddy yard, and held out the folder as if offering a gift. "You're making this hard on your wife," he said, eyes sliding to Helen like she was leverage, not a person. Helen's body flinched, but she moved anyway, stepping between Walter and the folder. Her voice shook, but it did not break. "We are not leaving," she said, the words coming from somewhere deeper than fear. "Not for your money, not for your threats." Derek's gaze sharpened, annoyance flashing like a blade. "Ma'am," he said, tone falsely patient, "this isn't personal. It's business." Then his hand shot out, not to strike, but to shove. Helen stumbled backward into the porch rail with a small cry. Walter surged forward instinctively, and Derek's second move was colder. He hooked Walter's cane with his boot and kicked it out. The cane skittered across the wet boards, and Walter went down hard, shoulder thudding into the mud. The sound was ugly, final, like a book dropping shut. Helen dropped to her knees beside him, hands fumbling at his jacket, panic rising in her throat. One of the younger men laughed, a short, uncertain sound, and the other stepped closer as if to prove he could. Ethan felt the familiar chill flood his veins, the part of him that learned long ago that the world doesn't stop on its own. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "Get your hands off them," he said, and his voice carried something older than anger, authority forged under worse skies. Derek turned and finally noticed the size of Ethan, the controlled stillness, the way Ranger stood beside him like a shadow with teeth. Derek smirked anyway, because arrogance is often louder than survival. "And who are you?" Derek asked, spreading his arms as if welcoming a fight. "This is private property." Ethan's eyes didn't blink. "So is my patience," he replied, and took one step forward. The bearded thug made a move toward Helen, maybe to yank her up, maybe to scare her. Helen's breath hitched. Ranger moved. Not frantic, not barking, not wild. The German Shepherd slipped between Helen and the man like a door closing, shoulder checking him with a brutal, clean impact that knocked him onto the porch boards. Ranger didn't bite. He didn't need to. He simply stood over the man, ears forward, lips barely lifted, a warning written in muscle. The other thug froze, suddenly remembering that courage is easy until it has consequences. Derek swung at Ethan, a clumsy punch fueled by ego. Ethan caught the wrist, turned it, and Derek's face changed when the joint threatened to become a lesson. Ethan twisted, stepped in, and dropped Derek into the mud with a controlled takedown that ended with Derek face down, breath knocked out, arm pinned. It took 3 heartbeats. The yard went quiet except for rain and Derek's stunned wheeze. Ethan looked at the 2 remaining men, voice low. "Pick him up. Leave." The younger men didn't argue. They hauled Derek to his feet, eyes wide now. The earlier swagger evaporated. Derek spat mud, hatred replacing surprise. "You think this is over?" he hissed, backing toward the truck. Ethan didn't answer. He helped Walter sit up, steadying him with one hand. Ranger immediately shifted, moving to Helen's side, pressing his head into her trembling palm the way he had done yesterday, grounding her with warmth and weight. Helen's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She just held Ranger's face like it was an anchor. Walter winced, pain sharp behind his stubborn expression. "I'm fine," he lied, the way proud men always do. Ethan didn't challenge the lie. He simply said, "Inside, now." He guided them in, scanning the tree line once, because he knew predators rarely hunt only once. Outside, Derek climbed into the driver's seat, hands shaking with rage more than fear. Before he slammed the door, he leaned out and threw one last line into the rain like a curse. "Next time, it won't be us," he said, voice cracked with spite. "Next time, it's the guy in the suit." The truck roared away, tires spitting gravel. Ethan watched it vanish down the road, then looked at the old house, the bruised couple, and the dog who had just turned terror into breath again. He felt the cliff edge under his feet, the moment where leaving becomes choosing. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the word suit echoed like the click of a safety being turned off. The next day arrived without drama, which in Cedar Hollow meant it arrived with discipline. The rain didn't fall in drops so much as it hovered, a gray veil pressed against windows, turning every sound into a whisper. Ethan sat at the small kitchen table in the Price house, hands wrapped around a mug that had "World's Best Grandpa" faded into near ghost. Walter was in his recliner, trying to breathe like the ribs were still his allies, while Helen moved between stove and sink with the quiet urgency of someone holding a home together by sheer will. Ranger lay near Walter's feet, head down, ears up, a silent equation. Comfort plus vigilance. When the knock came, it was not Derek's brutal pounding. It was 3 polite taps, measured, as if whoever stood outside believed manners could erase intention. Helen's shoulders rose, then fell. She opened the door. The man on the porch looked like he'd never been forced to jog in his life. He was in his 50s, tall and narrow, with carefully combed salt and pepper hair and a face that smiled without warmth. His suit was charcoal gray, crisp at the seams, shoes polished to the point of arrogance. He held a leather briefcase like it was a badge. "Mrs. Price," he said, voice smooth, practiced for boardrooms and courtrooms. "I'm Charles Whitman, counsel representing Grant Holloway's interests." Whitman's eyes flicked to Ethan, appraising him with the subtle contempt of a man who believes physical strength is a crude language. "And you are?" "A neighbor," Ethan said, letting the word sit. Ranger didn't move, but his gaze lifted, steady and unsettling, as if weighing Whitman's bones. Whitman offered a thin smile, then stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. That told Ethan everything. Whitman opened his briefcase on the table with careful precision. Papers emerged like white flags with sharp edges. "After yesterday's unfortunate misunderstanding," Whitman began, "Mr. Halloway has authorized me to extend a generous final offer for your property." He slid a document forward, then another, building a small tower of legality. Walter's face tightened. "I said no." Whitman nodded sympathetically, like a priest hearing a confession he planned to monetize. "Of course. Yet refusal does not prevent consequences." He tapped one page with a manicured finger. "Your land borders a protected drainage zone. There are potential environmental compliance issues." He tapped another. "Your porch steps are not to current code. Safety hazards. Liability." Another tap. "Your wiring, given the age of this structure, may be subject to inspection." His voice stayed gentle, which made the threats worse. Ethan watched Helen's hands. They had stopped moving. She was frozen, not from ignorance, but from recognition. Helen had lived long enough to know the most dangerous predator didn't bare teeth. It showed receipts. "We're not criminals," Helen said softly. "We're old." Whitman's smile widened a fraction, as if that helped his argument. "No one said criminal. The county is simply obligated to ensure public welfare. These matters can become exhausting." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Court dates, fines, condemnation proceedings, even temporary relocation if the home is deemed unsafe." Walter coughed then, a harsh rattle that shook his chest. The sound wasn't just illness. It was stress turning into biology. Ranger rose and pressed his shoulder against Walter's shin, steadying him, and Walter's trembling hand found Ranger's fur like a man finding a railing in a storm. Whitman noticed the gesture, misread it as weakness, and continued. "Mr. Halloway prefers peace," he said. "A simple transaction. But peace requires cooperation." Ethan felt heat climb his neck, the old impulse to end problems with direct force. He imagined grabbing Whitman by the collar and escorting him out like a bag of trash. Then he saw Helen's eyes, wide but controlled, and he understood the trap. If Ethan became the story, the prices would lose. Violence would be the excuse they needed. Ethan's jaw flexed. He swallowed the rage like a weapon he couldn't afford to fire. "Is this the part where you leave?" Ethan asked. "Or the part where you keep pretending you're doing them a favor?" Whitman straightened, offended at being spoken to like a person. "Mr. Brooks," he said, reading Ethan's name from the air as if he'd already done homework. "You're not on the deed. You're not family. Any interference may be construed as intimidation." Ethan's smile was small, humorless. "You came with intimidation in a briefcase." Whitman's expression hardened, and he gathered the papers with deliberate slowness. "You have 72 hours, he said to Helen, as if Ethan were furniture. "After that, the county will take an interest." He left his card on the table like a final insult and walked out into the mist. 2 hours later, the first inspector arrived. He was a short man in a neon rain jacket, with a clipboard and anxious eyes that didn't like meeting anyone's gaze. He introduced himself as Environmental Compliance, said it too fast, and immediately began photographing puddles like they were evidence of sin. Next came a building code officer, a heavy-set man with a tired face and a permanent scowl, boots dripping mud across the kitchen mat, while he muttered about handrails and risers and liability exposure. A third vehicle followed, labeled electrical safety. The woman who stepped out was mid-40s, athletic build, hair pulled into a severe ponytail, eyes sharp with the boredom of someone who'd seen too many kitchens and cared about none of them. She wore rubber gloves like armor and spoke in clipped sentences, as if kindness took too long. Ethan moved through the house with them, answering as little as possible, watching them measure and photograph and label, turning a family home into a case file. It was warfare by 1,000 tiny stamps. By late afternoon, Walter's cough had worsened. He insisted it was nothing, but his lips had a faint bluish tint that made Helen's smile wobble. When Walter tried to stand, his knees hesitated. Ranger rose instantly, body aligned beside him like a living cane, offering support without shame. Helen pretended not to notice the tears forming, because if she started, she might not stop. Ethan stepped outside to breathe, rain slicking his hair, and found a woman waiting by the porch steps with a camera slung over her shoulder. She was late 20s, tall and wiry, with copper-brown skin freckled by sun she probably didn't get enough of. Her dark hair was cut in a messy bob that looked like it had been attacked by deadlines. Her eyes were green hazel, bright with the kind of curiosity that gets people in trouble. "You're Ethan Brooks," she said without preamble. "And that's not just a dog." She nodded toward Ranger. "I'm Maya Reed. I write for the Hollow Gazette, which is a fancy way of saying I try to keep this town from being eaten quietly." Ethan didn't relax, but he listened. Maya's voice had a steady bluntness, sharpened by disappointment. "Holloway's been buying land through shell companies and donations," she said. "He owns smiles. He owns permits. He owns silence. Yesterday's thugs were just the loud part." She glanced past Ethan into the house, where Helen moved like a ghost among clipboards. "He wants them to fold without a fight. Paperwork is his favorite fist." Ethan felt Ranger's presence at his side, warm and calm. "What do you need?" Ethan asked. Maya's smile flashed, quick as a match. "A missing piece. Proof that the county isn't acting on its own. A link between Holloway's money and these sudden inspections." Ethan nodded once, the decision forming like a storm front. "Then we'll find it." That night, after the inspectors finally left, Helen insisted on driving Walter to pick up medication from the pharmacy in town. Walter's hands shook on the steering wheel, stubbornness refusing to surrender control. Ethan followed in his own vehicle, Ranger riding shotgun, eyes scanning the darkness. When they returned, Ethan walked past the price car and stopped. Something under the rear bumper caught the beam of his flashlight. A small black box, no bigger than a deck of cards, magnet clamped to the frame, with a faint blinking light like a slow heartbeat. Ethan's stomach went cold. He crouched, careful not to touch it, and Ranger's growl rolled low, protective and precise. This wasn't an inspector's tool. This was a watcher's. Ethan looked toward the forest, where the trees stood like tall witnesses who never testified. He had a sudden, sick certainty that someone out there had already decided the prices were not people, only obstacles. And obstacles, in Cedar Hollow, didn't just get moved. Sometimes they got erased. The storm arrived like a verdict, wind driving rain sideways so hard it looked nailed to the air. Cedar Hollow's power lines hissed, trees bent and groaned, and the ocean beyond the bluffs sounded less like water and more like something ancient clearing its throat. Ethan Brooks stood in the price kitchen with his sleeves rolled up, jaw tight, staring at the small black tracker he'd removed from beneath the car using a plastic bag and a steady hand. He didn't need a technician to tell him what it meant. Someone wanted to know where the prices went, when they left, how long they stayed gone, and whether the house ever sat empty enough to become an accident. He felt the old SEAL part of him slide into place, not excitement, not pride, just a cold readiness that made emotion feel like a luxury item. Helen Price watched him from the doorway, face drawn and pale in the lamplight, her knit cap now replaced by a scarf wrapped too tight around her neck, as if she could squeeze out fear. Walter Price sat at the table, shoulders hunched, coughing into a handkerchief he tried to fold neatly afterward, like manners could keep panic from spreading. Ranger paced once, then returned to Helen, pressing his black and tan head into her hip, grounding her with warm weight. "They're watching us," Helen whispered. Ethan nodded. "And tonight they might stop watching." He spoke gently, but he didn't soften the truth. The first thunderclap hit as he moved them. The storm cellar was really a reinforced storage space under the kitchen, old concrete walls, a low ceiling, and shelves lined with jars and canned food like an ark built for smaller floods. Ethan checked the latch, tested the hinge, then handed Walter a compact handheld radio, the kind fishermen used when fog swallowed boats. "If you hear me say harbor, you stay down here no matter what," he instructed. Walter bristled at being managed, pride still trying to stand taller than his body. Ethan met his eyes, calm as stone. "This isn't about pride. It's about not giving them a chance." Walter swallowed the protest. Helen clutched the radio to her chest, then surprised Ethan by reaching down to Ranger. Her fingers found the dog's thick fur, and her voice steadied as if the warmth transferred through skin. "You'll keep him safe," she told Ranger, not asking, declaring. Ranger's ears lifted, and his tail gave one controlled thump, the closest thing to a vow. Ethan set up the yard like a man borrowing tools from memory. He rigged 2 old halogen floodlights Walter used for night crabbing, positioning them to blast the porch and driveway. He placed simple pressure alerts, improvised from fishing line and small bells, along likely approach paths. He didn't have Ben's tech, but he had time, a storm, and a dog who heard danger the way some people heard music. As darkness thickened, Ethan took position near the living room window, watching the tree line, letting the storm mask his breathing. Ranger stayed beside him until Ethan gave a hand signal, then the dog melted into the shadows like a thought slipping behind the eyes. Minutes passed. Then the wind shifted, and Ethan felt it, that sensation of being hunted by professionals who didn't stomp or shout. He saw them only because Ranger saw them first. The German Shepherd reappeared briefly at the edge of the porch, body low and still, then disappeared again, guiding Ethan's gaze toward a shape moving with careful intent. A team emerged from the rain, not 3 loud thugs this time, but 6 figures in dark rain gear, faces hidden under hoods, footsteps measured. They moved in pairs, covering angles, pausing when branches shifted, as if the forest itself might testify against them. The man leading them was tall and lean, his posture too disciplined for a local contractor. Even through the storm, his movements had the economical precision of military training. He raised a gloved hand, 2 fingers flicking, and the team spread like ink in water. Ethan felt a grim respect, then pushed it away. Respect didn't matter. Only outcome did. One pair drifted toward the porch. The point man reached for the handle. Ethan waited, because impatience was how you died. The handle turned. The door didn't open. The chain held. The man leaned in, listening. Ranger struck. No bark, no warning. The dog seemed to appear from nowhere behind the intruder, slamming shoulder first into the back of his knees. The man dropped with a muffled curse, and before he could recover, Ranger pinned him with weight and menace, teeth visible but restrained, as if saying, "I can do worse, but I'm choosing not to." The second intruder spun, raising something metallic. Ethan hit the floodlights. The yard exploded into white glare, forcing the men to shield their eyes. Ethan moved fast now, a dark figure crossing wet boards, grabbing the second intruder's wrist and twisting until the object clattered away. He drove the man back with controlled force, not rage, not cruelty, just decisive mechanics. In the confusion, the remaining team tried to regroup, but Ranger's presence broke their rhythm. The dog darted, cut off lines, forced them to react instead of execute. That was the thing professionals hated most, unpredictability. Then, through the curtain of rain, a new vehicle rolled up, too smooth, too confident. A black SUV, headlights steady, tires barely slipping, as if the storm had signed a non-aggression pact with money. A man stepped out, holding an umbrella that looked absurdly pristine in the chaos. Grant Holloway, finally in flesh. He was in his early 60s, tall, silver hair perfectly styled, jawline sharp as a contract clause. His face was handsome in the way magazine covers were handsome, curated, practiced, empty in the wrong places. He wore a tailored coat over a suit, and his expression suggested he expected the world to move aside when he arrived. Even the private security men looked momentarily uncertain, like employees caught off script. Holloway's eyes found Walter, who had ignored instructions and climbed the cellar steps when he heard the commotion, stubborn as an old oak leaning toward the wind. "Mr. Price," Holloway called, voice calm and intimate, as if they were old friends meeting in bad weather. "Let's end this. You sign, you keep your dignity. You refuse, and tonight becomes a tragedy no one can stop." He stepped close and grabbed Walter's jacket, hauling him forward. In his other hand he held a small metal tool, pressed it near Walter's throat with a cruelty disguised as inevitability. "Sign," Holloway said, "or he doesn't see morning." Helen's scream tore through the storm. She burst from the cellar doorway despite herself, the radio forgotten, her body moving on love rather than logic. Ethan lunged to intercept, but she was already there, shaking, hands raised. "Please," she begged, and the word tasted like ash. Ethan felt anger flash hot enough to burn through training. He forced it down. Rage was what Holloway wanted. Ethan's eyes tracked details. Holloway's grip, the angle of the tool, the distance between Holloway's elbow and Walter's ribs, the slight tremor in Walter's knees. Ranger read something deeper. Helen's fear, Walter's pain, Ethan's intent. The dog surged forward, but not at Walter, not blindly at Holloway's face. Ranger snapped onto the strap and sleeve line that anchored Holloway's grip, yanking hard enough to break the leverage without tearing flesh. Holloway staggered, shocked not by danger, but by the violation of his control. Ethan used the half-second like a key turning. He wrenched the tool away, shoved Walter toward Helen with one arm, and slammed Holloway down onto the wet porch boards. Holloway hit the wood with a grunt, umbrella rolling away like a defeated flag. Ethan held him there, voice low and lethal. "It's over." Holloway's eyes burned with hate, not fear, the hatred of a man realizing money could be resisted. Sirens cut through the wind. A patrol car fishtailed into the driveway, followed by another. Deputy Tom Alvarez jumped out first, young, late 20s, broad-shouldered with a clean-shaven face and rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. His eyes were tired in a way that didn't match his age, like he'd been swallowing compromises for too long. He raised his weapon, hands steady, voice firm. "Everyone on the ground. Now!" Behind him, Maya Reed appeared from the passenger side of a second vehicle, phone held up in a waterproof case, her face lit by the harsh glow of the screen. She was streaming, Ethan realized, broadcasting the scene to anyone in Cedar Hollow still awake. It wasn't just a rescue. It was exposure. The private security men froze, glancing between the deputy, the cameras, and Holloway pinned in the rain. One by one, they dropped their hands. Handcuffs clicked like punctuation at the end of a sentence someone thought they could keep running forever. When the storm finally softened, Helen collapsed against Ranger, sobbing into his thick fur. not from weakness, but from release. Ranger stood still, letting her borrow his steadiness. Walter, shaken and furious at himself, gripped Ethan's forearm with a trembling hand. "Thank you," he said, the words heavy because pride had to step aside to make room for gratitude. Ethan nodded, unable to trust his own voice yet. Maya approached, face pale despite the adrenaline, and her eyes held a new kind of fear. "Ethan," she said quietly, lowering her phone, "Holloway isn't the real owner. He's a front. There's a black fund behind him, and they just sent someone to clean up what he failed to finish." Dawn in Cedar Hollow didn't arrive with sunlight so much as surrender. The storm peeled back in slow strips, leaving the world washed and bruised, branches littering the road, puddles shining like cracked mirrors, and the sea beyond the bluffs heaving as if it had spent the night arguing with the sky. Ethan Brooks stood on the Price porch, watching a thin line of pale gold creep along the horizon. He felt the aftershock in his bones, that familiar post-contact silence where the body keeps waiting for the next hit even when the air has calmed. Ranger sat at his side, black and tan coat still damp, ears forward but relaxed, tail giving the smallest, controlled sweep against the boards. The dog's presence was a tether, tugging Ethan back from the edge of old memories. Inside, Walter Price lay on the couch with a blanket over his knees, a mug of tea balanced between hands that trembled less than yesterday. His face looked older in the morning, but his eyes carried a stubborn spark that hadn't been extinguished. Helen Price moved quietly through the kitchen, making tea the way some people make prayers, carefully, repeatedly, as if routine could stitch the night back into something survivable. Deputy Tom Alvarez returned after sunrise, uniform rumpled, rainwater still darkening his sleeves. Up close, he looked younger than Ethan first thought. Late 20s, broad shoulders, a straight nose, a faint shadow of stubble, and eyes that had learned what compromise tasted like. He carried a folder in a plastic sleeve, and the way he held it suggested he finally had something heavier than doubt. "I filed the arrests," Tom said, voice low. "County can't pretend this was a misunderstanding now. Not with Maya's footage." Maya Reed arrived an hour later with wind-blown hair and a hoodie pulled over her messy bob, face pale but lit with a fierce kind of purpose. She looked like someone who'd slept 20 minutes and spent the rest of the night choosing truth over safety. "It's not just Holloway," she said immediately, dropping a stack of printed pages onto the kitchen table as if it might explode. "He's a front man. The land purchases run through a pipeline of shell LLCs that all feed into one pooled account." She tapped a highlighted section with a trembling finger. "A black fund. They're using the bluff access to reach the cove. Not for yachts. For night transfers, unregistered boats, quiet cargo." Ethan's jaw tightened as he scanned the pages. In his mind, the coast rearranged itself into a map of risks. The hidden inlet, the blind curves, the way fog made even law feel optional. Walter's voice rasped from the couch. "My boy used to fish those waters," he said, eyes distant. "He always said the cove was too calm, like it was hiding something." Helen swallowed hard and set another cup on the table without being asked, then placed her hand briefly on Ranger's head. The dog leaned into her touch, steady, a living reminder that comfort could still exist without permission. Tom flipped open his folder. "I'm forwarding all of this to federal contacts," he said, and something in his posture changed when he said it, like a man finally standing on solid ground. "Not state, not county, federal. Because if there's money laundering and maritime smuggling, it's bigger than Cedar Hollow." Ethan nodded once. He knew the look on Tom's face. It was the look of someone deciding to stop being afraid of the wrong people. Holloway, meanwhile, sat in the back of a patrol car down the driveway, watched by an officer with a blanket over his shoulders, like a mockery of mercy. Even from a distance, Holloway held himself like a man who believed consequences were negotiable. When Tom walked out to question him, Ethan followed to the edge of the porch, Ranger padding quietly beside him. Holloway's silver hair was damp now, less perfect, and his expression was a mixture of outrage and calculation. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You don't understand what you've stepped into." His voice tried to climb into authority, but the night had scraped some of the polish off. Tom didn't flinch. "Then explain it," Tom said. "Explain the private security team. Explain the tracker under the price car. Explain why your lawyer started a paper war before you started a real one." Holloway's eyes darted toward Ethan, and for the first time, something like fear flickered, not of Ethan's fists, but of Ethan's refusal to leave. "I can make this go away," Holloway said, trying a different key in the lock. "I can give them money. I can give you money." Ethan watched the offer land in the mud. It didn't even bounce. "He thinks everything is a receipt," Helen whispered, more to herself than anyone, and the bitterness in her voice sounded like a decade of being underestimated. Holloway leaned forward as far as the cuffs allowed, lowering his voice. "You don't know who funds this," he hissed to Tom. "If I talk, I'm dead." Tom's eyes hardened. "If you don't talk," he replied, "you're still not walking free." That was the moment Holloway realized the town had changed shape overnight. He opened his mouth as if to bargain again, then shut it, jaw clenching as if an invisible hand had tightened around his throat. He looked past Tom toward the road, toward the forest, toward the cove, and Ethan read it clearly. Someone else held Holloway's leash, and they were pulling it hard. Maya stepped closer, phone already recording. "Say it anyway," she challenged, voice trembling but firm. "Say who's behind you." Holloway's face drained of color. He stared at the camera like it was a loaded weapon, and he said nothing. Silence, Ethan realized, could be proof too. Tom finished the interview and returned to the porch. "Feds are en route," he said, "and I'm not calling the county about it. I'm calling the people who don't owe Holloway favors." The day unfolded in a strange, cautious brightness. A pair of dark SUVs arrived on the main road, unmarked, efficient, the kind of vehicles that didn't need sirens to get out of the way. Two agents stepped out, both wearing plain jackets and the calm faces of people who had seen worse rooms than Cedar Hollow's diner. One was a woman in her 40s, tall and lean, with dark hair pulled back and eyes the color of storm steel. She introduced herself as Special Agent Marisol Grant, voice crisp and no nonsense, a woman who didn't waste words because words were often where lies hid. The other agent, a broad man with a shaved head and a quiet gaze, carried a sealed evidence bag as if it weighed nothing. They spoke to Tom, collected Maya's documents, and walked the property line with instruments that clicked softly, as though even machines were whispering now. Ethan didn't insert himself. He watched from a distance, letting process do what fists couldn't. In the afternoon, Walter insisted on standing outside. He moved slowly, leaning on the cane again, but his spine was straighter than it had been in weeks. He walked to the porch corner where a wind chime hung, tangled and silent from the storm. With shaking hands, he untwisted it, then hung it properly. The shells clinked once in the breeze, a small sound, almost laughable compared to gunfire and threats, yet it hit Ethan harder than any punch. Walter looked over his shoulder at Ethan. "They wanted us to feel like this place was already gone," Walter said, "but it's still here." Helen brought 3 cups of tea to the porch, setting one down beside Ethan without asking. The gesture was simple, domestic, and it felt like a door opening. Ranger made his rounds, nosing Helen's hand, then Walter's, then Ethan's, as if stamping each of them with the same quiet agreement. "You belong to one another now, whether you plan to or not." It was the bridge Ethan hadn't known he needed, built out of fur and patience. Later, when night returned, it returned softer. The Price house was still standing. The road outside still belonged to their feet. Holloway was gone in a convoy of authority that did not smile at bribes. Ethan walked back to his cabin under a sky that finally showed a few tired stars. He lay down fully clothed out of habit, then stopped, exhaled, and took off his boots. Ranger settled at the door, not rigid, not hunting, just watching because that was what he did, and because love sometimes looked like vigilance. Ethan closed his eyes and waited for the usual nightmare to drag him under. It didn't come. He fell into sleep like stepping onto solid ground, and somewhere between midnight and morning, Ranger's tail thumped once, a small, quiet rhythm that sounded like home. Sometimes the miracle isn't thunder splitting the sky or money falling like rain. Sometimes it's quieter. A door that doesn't burn. A home that still stands at dawn. A frightened heart that finds its breath again. In Cedar Hollow, help arrived in the form of a steadfast man and a loyal dog. But the deeper wonder was this. When darkness tried to buy silence, courage spread from one porch to an entire town. That's how God often works, not always with spectacle, but with small lights that refuse to go out. And maybe that's the kind of miracle you need too. Not a perfect life, but the strength to take one faithful step today, to make the hard phone call, to forgive, to set a boundary, to protect what is right, to keep going when fear is loud. If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who needs hope right now. Comment below. Who felt like the true hero to you, Ethan, Helen, and Walter, or Ranger the faithful guardian? And don't forget to subscribe, because we're building a community that believes courage is contagious and no one has to face the storm alone. Before you go, let's say a prayer together. May God bless you and keep you safe. May He strengthen your hands for the work in front of you, soften your heart with peace, and surround your home with protection. And may He send you, in the perfect moment, the help you need and the courage to become that help for someone else. Amen.